The air in the ballroom was thick with perfume and laughter, a glittering cage of noise that pressed against my skin. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm sharing this with you because it's been locked inside me for too long, a weight I've carried in silence. That evening at my cousin's wedding reception, I stood alone by the dessert table, my fingers curled, around a glass of tepid Chardonnay, watching my family move through the room like I didn't exist. They hadn't even saved me a seat. My sister Karen swept past in a shimmering mauve gown, her eyes catching mine, just long enough to flash a pitying smirk. "Margaret, don't hover there like a lost soul," she said, her voice loud enough to draw titters from her friends. "Why don't you make yourself useful?" "The kitchen could use a hand." I gave her a small smile, the kind you perfect when your heart has learned to absorb blows. I didn't reply. I never do. The room was a spectacle of small-town ambition, draped in satin and ambition, where people like us pretended we were more than we seemed. I'd worn my only good dress, a navy sheath I'd bought years ago, for a funeral it seems still holding, despite the passage of time. It hung a little looser now, mirroring the way my life felt frayed but intact. At 48, I was nothing to them, a spinster, a shadow, the one they invited because they had to. My brother Tom sat at a nearby table, his arm around his wife, his voice carrying over the music. "Why does Margaret even bother showing up?" he muttered, not caring if I heard. I did. I always do. But I stood there, my posture rigid, my hands steady, because you learn to hold yourself upright when you carry a truth no one else can touch. I could have walked away. The glass door to the parking lot was just steps behind me, promising cool night air and escape from their sharp tongues. I wanted to go to slip into the dark where no one would notice my absence, but something kept me there, pride perhaps, or a stubborn flicker of something I hadn't named in years. I took a sip of my wine, the glass cold against my lips, and watched the bride, my cousin's daughter, Emily, twirl across the dance floor with her father. She was 22, radiant with youth and promise, and I remembered being that age, though my path had been carved through shadows, not light. A path no one here could fathom. Karen's voice sliced through the air again, sharp and deliberate. "Margaret, you're just standing there looking pitiful. Go keep Aunt June company or something." Aunt June was 80. Her hearing faded, her hands busy with knitting in a corner of the room. I nodded my smile, unwavering, and drifted toward the back where the lights were dimmer and the crowd thinner. The band struck up a lively tune, and the guests cheered as Emily tossed her bouquet into a cluster of eager hands. I didn't move to catch it. I never had. As I passed the head table, I caught my mother's gaze for a fleeting moment. She turned away quick, as if I were a stranger she didn't want to acknowledge. That's when it hit me, a pain so sharp it stole my breath to them I was invisible. And maybe in some ways I'd chosen to be. I found a metal folding chair tucked against the wall, half hidden by a drooping fern, and sank into it. My hands rested in my lap, fingers laced tightly, my breathing slow and deliberate. Their dismissal was a familiar weight, settling into my bones like winter's chill. But there was something else stirring inside me, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. It was a quiet spark, fragile but persistent, glowing beneath the ashes of their words. I didn't know then that soon that spark would flare into something undeniable, something that would change everything. I'm telling you this because it's more than my story. It's for anyone who's ever been pushed to the margins, who's carried a truth too heavy to voice. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt unseen, please hit that subscribe button. Stay with me here because I'm going to share it all. The hurt, the silence, and the moment it all shattered open. This is where it starts. The reception stretched on the night, growing long and loud, and I stayed in my chair, watching from the edges. They danced, they toasted, they forgot I was there. But I hadn't forgotten who I was, not completely. I'd spent years burying it, hiding it beneath their assumptions, beneath my own carefully crafted silence. My family thought they knew me, Margaret the quiet the one who never married, who lived alone in a modest apartment, and worked a job they never bothered to understand. They didn't know about the nights I'd spent in secure rooms poring over maps and encrypted files. They didn't know about the missions that left scars I'd never reveal, or the oath I'd sworn to keep it all secret. They didn't know about Sparrow. I wasn't always this reserved. There was a time when my words held power, when my presence could hush a room. But that life felt like a dream now, one I'd walked away from, or so I thought. Sitting there in that cold metal chair, I felt the past stir a faint whisper against my skin, like a memory I couldn't quite shake. I didn't know then that the past was waiting, that it would soon step into a room full of people who'd dismissed me and demand to be acknowledged. The band shifted to a slower melody, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the notes wash over me, drowning out their laughter. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years, but I felt it, the deep ache of being overlooked, the burden of a secret I could never share. Yet even in that moment, I knew I wasn't nothing. I was Margaret Elise Kane, and I had been someone they could never comprehend. As the night wore on, the crowd spilled outside to watch fireworks burst across the sky, their colors reflecting in the ballroom's tall windows. I stayed behind, gathering empty plates from deserted tables, my movements automatic. Karen passed by, her arm linked with her husband's, her eyes sliding past me like I was part of the furniture. I didn't expect her to stop. But as I stacked the plates, my fingers grazed the edge of a butter knife, and I froze. It was dull, harmless, but for a fleeting second, it reminded me of another kind of steel-cold precise. The kind that could alter the course of a night, a mission, a life. I set the knife down carefully, my breath even, and continued clearing the tables. The fireworks painted the room in flashes of red and gold, and I told myself it was enough to be here to be quiet, to be unseen. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Not anymore. The truth was, I'd spent years letting them define me, letting their words shape the edges of my life. But beneath the surface, beneath the navy dress, and the polite smiles, I was still Sparrow. I'd walked through fire-carried secrets that could topple nations and come out the other side. I'd chosen silence not because I was weak, but because I'd learned that some truths are too heavy for others to bear. Yet sitting there surrounded by their careless laughter, I felt the weight of that silence pressing harder than ever. I glanced at the glass door again, the one leading to the parking lot. It would be so easy to leave, to slip away, and let them forget me entirely. But I didn't. Instead, I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my dress, and stayed. I didn't know why not then. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the part of me that still remembered who I'd been. The part that refused to be erased. The band played on, and I watched Emily laugh with her new husband, her face glowing with the kind of joy I'd once known in fleeting moments between missions. I envied her not for her youth or her happiness, but for the way the world saw her, celebrated her. No one celebrated me, not anymore. But as I sat there, the spark inside me grew just a little, and I felt a shift like the first crack in a dam. Something was coming. I couldn't name it, but I felt it deep in my bones. The night ended with the crowd returning from the fireworks, their voices louder now, their faces flushed with excitement. I stood smoothing my dress again and moved to the dessert table to tidy up. No one noticed, no one cared. But as I worked, I caught my reflection in a silver tray, distorted but clear enough to see the lines around my eyes, the set of my jaw. I looked like a woman who'd lived through something, who'd carried something, and I had. The morning after the wedding, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against my apartment window, a soft, relentless rhythm that matched the ache in my chest. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night, before replaying like a film I couldn't pause. Karen's smirk, Tom's muttered disdain, my mother's averted gaze. They stung, yes, but they weren't new. What lingered, what kept me pinned to the bed, was the way I'd felt that spark, that faint pulse of something I'd buried long ago. It wasn't anger or defiance, but memory, a reminder of who I'd been before I became Margaret Elise Kane, the invisible aunt, the family burden. I closed my eyes and the past came rushing in, unbidden like a door I'd forgotten to lock. I was 24, standing in a dimly lit room that smelled of coffee and ozone, the hum of computers filling the silence. My hair was pulled back tight, my uniform crisp, my hands steady as I slid a folder across a table to a man whose name I'd never know. "Sparrow," he said, his voice low respectful. "This changes everything." I nodded, my heart pounding, but my face calm. "Because that's what you did when you were Sparrow. You didn't flinch, didn't falter, even when the weight of a nation rested on your next move." That night, I decrypted a message that stopped a crisis before it could ignite my fingers flying over keys while sweat beaded on my neck. I didn't sleep for 2 days, but when it was done, I walked out into the dawn, the sky bruising purple, and felt alive. I was someone then, someone who mattered. I opened my eyes, the rain still falling, and sat up slowly. My apartment was small, the kind of place you'd pass without noticing beige walls. A second-hand couch, a single bookshelf holding novels I hadn't opened in years. It was a life designed to be overlooked, and I'd built it that way on purpose. After I left the agency, after the missions and the oaths and the scars, I'd chosen this quiet, this invisibility. Not because I was ashamed, but because the world I'd lived in demanded silence even now. The oath I'd taken at 22 in a room with no windows still bound me. Some secrets you carry to your grave. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and felt the weight of that promise settle over me again. I didn't talk about Sparrow. I didn't talk about the nights I'd spent in foreign cities, my pulse racing as I slipped through shadows, or the mornings I'd woken to coded messages that could mean life or death. I didn't talk about the people I'd saved or the ones I couldn't. Those memories lived in my bones, in the way I still checked exits before, sitting down in the way I could hear a lie in someone's voice before they finished speaking. But to my family, to this town, I was just Margaret, unmarried, unremarkable. A woman who'd somehow failed at life. I stood and moved to the kitchen, filling the kettle with water, my hands moving on instinct. As it hissed to life, I leaned against the counter, my mind drifting back again. I was 27, crouched in a safe house, the air thick with dust and fear. My partner, a man called Hawk, was bleeding his shoulder, torn open by a bullet meant for me. "Stay with me, Sparrow," he whispered, his voice fading. I pressed my hands against the wound, my training kicking in my voice steady as I radioed for extraction. He survived, but I didn't sleep for weeks, seeing his blood on my hands every time I closed my eyes. That was the first time I understood what it cost to be Sparrow. Not just the danger, but the loneliness. You couldn't share, it couldn't explain it. You carried it alone. The kettle whistled, pulling me back, and I poured the water over a tea bag, watching the steam curl upward. I wondered, not for the first time, if I'd made the right choice. When I left the agency at 35, burned out and haunted, I thought I could start over, become someone new. I moved back to this town, took a clerical job at the county office, and let my family's assumptions wrap around me like a cloak. They called me a spinster, a nobody, and I let them because it was easier than explaining a life they'd never believe. Sometimes, though, I forgot I'd ever been anything else. Sometimes I looked in the mirror and saw only Margaret, not Sparrow, and it hurt more than I could admit. I carried my tea to the window, watching the rain streak the glass. My reflection stared back, faint and ghostly graying hair, pulled into a loose bun eyes that held too many secrets. I wasn't old, not really, but I felt it, the way the years had carved lines into my face, the way my family's words had carved deeper ones into my heart. Karen had called me pitiful last night, and maybe she was right. Not because I was alone, but because I'd let myself disappear even from myself. Another memory flickered sharper this time. I was 30, standing on a rooftop in a city I can't name, the wind whipping my hair as I waited for a signal. The mission was high stakes, the kind where failure wasn't an option. I'd been awake for 36 hours, my body running on adrenaline and black coffee. But when the signal came, a single flash of light across the skyline, I moved without hesitation. I climbed down a fire escape, my boots silent on the metal, and delivered a package that shifted the balance of power in ways I'd never fully understand. When it was over, my handler shook my hand, his grip firm. "Sparrow," he said, "you're one of a kind." I believed him then. I don't know if I still do. I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through me, and felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or longing. Not for the danger, I didn't miss that, but for the clarity, the purpose. Back then I knew who I was. Every choice, every risk had weight. Now my days were a blur of paperwork and polite nods of dodging Karen's barbs and Tom's indifference. I'd chosen this life, but sometimes in the quiet moments, I wondered if I'd betrayed Sparrow by locking her away. I set the mug down and moved to my closet, pulling out a small metal box I hadn't touched in years. It was locked to the key, hidden in a drawer, and I hesitated before opening it. Inside were fragments of that other life, a faded ID badge, a commendation letter. I'd never shown anyone a single bullet casing from a mission that nearly ended me. I ran my fingers over the letter, the words blurred by time, but still legible. "For extraordinary service, Sparrow." I closed the box, my heart heavy, and hid it away again. Some things were better left buried. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and I dressed for the day. Slacks, a blouse, the uniform of a life that asked nothing of me. As I tied my scarf, I caught myself humming a habit from those long nights waiting for orders. It was a small thing, but it made me pause. Sparrow was still there somewhere inside me waiting. I didn't know what for, not yet, but I felt her like a pulse beneath my skin. I stepped outside, the air damp and cool, and walked to the corner store for milk. Mrs. Delaney, the cashier, smiled, but didn't ask how I was. No one did. I paid, my movements automatic, and headed home, the plastic bag swinging at my side. A car sped by, splashing my shoes, and I didn't flinch. I'd faced worse, but as I walked, I thought of Hawk, of that rooftop, of the man who'd called me one of a kind. I thought of the oath I'd taken, the one that still kept me silent, even when Karen laughed or Tom looked through me. Back in my apartment, I put the milk away and sat at the kitchen table, my hands folded. The spark from last night was still there, stronger now, like a fire catching. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. I was Margaret Elise Kane, but I was also Sparrow, and that truth was starting to stir, restless, unwilling to stay hidden much longer. The days after the wedding blurred into the familiar rhythm of my life, each one folding into the next like pages in a book no one bothered to read. I woke early, the sky still gray, and moved through my apartment with the precision of habit coffee, brewing toast browning, the radio humming low with news I half listened to. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm telling you this because it's the part of the story where I carried on, where I swallowed the hurt and kept moving, because that's what you do when the world expects nothing from you. But every step, every breath was a choice, to stay, to endure, even when the weight of their words pressed harder than I could admit. At the county office where I worked, I sat at a desk tucked in the corner, processing permits and filing reports no one ever thanked me for. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the beige walls, and my coworkers chatted about their weekends, their voices a distant hum. They didn't ask about mine, they never did. To them, I was Margaret, the quiet one, the one who kept the coffee pot full and the files in order. "You're a lifesaver, Margaret," my boss, Linda, would say, but it was the kind of praise you give a machine, not a person. I smiled, nodded, and kept my hands busy. Because that's how you survive being invisible, you make yourself useful. But it wasn't just at work. The town itself seemed to have decided who I was. At the grocery store, Mrs. Harper, who'd known me since I was a girl, would pat my hand and say, "You're so good to stay here, Margaret, looking after your mother." She didn't know my mother barely spoke to me, that her house was a place I visited out of duty, not love. At church on Sundays, the younger women, Emily's friends with their bright smiles and new babies, would nod politely, but never invite me to their coffee groups. Poor Margaret. I overheard one whisper once, living all alone like that. Such a shame. I kept my eyes on the hymn book, my voice steady, and sang louder, because sometimes the only way to drown out pity is to make your own sound. My family was the worst of it, though. Karen called me a week after the wedding, her voice sharp through the phone. "You didn't even congratulate Emily properly," she said, as if I hadn't sent a card and a check I couldn't really afford. "Honestly, Margaret, you're so awkward at these things. It's like you don't even try." I stood in my kitchen, the receiver pressed to my ear, and felt the familiar sting. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was easier than arguing. Easier than explaining that I'd been pushed to the edges of that night, that I'd felt like a ghost in my own skin. She sighed loud and dramatic. "You're lucky we even invite you, you know. You're such a burden sometimes." The line went quiet, and I hung up my hands trembling, but my face calm. I'd learned long ago to keep the hurt inside, to let it settle like sediment at the bottom of a river. Tom was no better. I saw him at the hardware store a few days later, picking up paint for his new house. He nodded at me, his smile tight, and said, "Still at that desk job, Margaret? You ever think about doing something more?" He didn't wait for an answer, just turned to the cashier. His laughter loud as he joked about his golf game. I stood there holding a pack of light bulbs and felt the weight of his dismissal. He didn't know about the nights I'd spent deciphering codes that saved lives or the missions that left me with nightmares I still didn't talk about. To him, I was just his older sister, the one who'd never amounted to anything. I paid for my bulbs and left the bell above the door jangling behind me, my steps steady, even as my heart twisted. But I wasn't always steady. There were moments alone in my apartment when the weight of it all threatened to crack me open. I'd sit on my couch, the TV flickering with some show I wasn't watching, and feel the loneliness like a physical thing, heavy and cold. Sometimes I'd think of Sparrow, of the woman I'd been fearless, sharp alive, and wonder where she'd gone. I'd open that metal box in my closet, just for a moment, and touch the commendation letter, the bullet casing the faded badge. "For extraordinary service," Sparrow the letter said, and I'd whisper the words to myself, a reminder that I'd been more than this once. Then I'd lock the box away, because remembering hurt too much, and I had to keep going. Yet even in those moments, I tried to be kind. When Mrs. Delaney at the corner store struggled with her bags, I carried them to her car, rain-soaking my coat. When Linda's daughter was sick, I stayed late at the office, finishing reports so Linda could be home. When Emily's thank you note arrived brief and formal, I wrote back with warmth, wishing her joy in her new life. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because I knew what it was to be unseen, and I refused to let their coldness make me cold. If I was a burden, I'd be a quiet one, a gentle one, the kind that left no mark. Still, their words found their mark. At a family dinner at my mother's house, the table crowded with Karen's kids and Tom's new wife. I sat at the end, passing dishes and listening to their chatter. Karen was boasting about her promotion, her voice bright with pride. "Not everyone can climb the ladder like that," she said, glancing at me. "Some people just stay where they are." The table laughed a quick, uncomfortable sound, and I felt my cheeks burn. I could have told them about the rooms I'd walked into where generals stood when I entered, where my decisions shaped the course of history. But I didn't. I passed the mashed potatoes and said nothing because Sparrow was a secret I couldn't share, even to defend myself. My mother was the hardest. She'd always been distant, but now in her 70s, she seemed to resent my presence. "You should have married Margaret," she said that night, her voice low, as I helped her clear the table. "You could have had a life instead of this." She gestured vaguely at me, as if my entire existence was a disappointment. I knotted my hands full of plates and kept moving. But later in her kitchen, as I scrubbed the dishes alone, I felt the spark from the wedding night flare again, sharper this time. It wasn't anger, not yet, but it was close a refusal to let her words be the whole truth. I dried my hands and stepped outside, the night air cool against my face. The stars were out, faint but steady, and I stood there, my breath visible in the chill. I thought of Hawk, my old partner, his voice rough as he'd said, "Stay with me, Sparrow." I thought of the rooftop, the signal flashing across the skyline, the weight of a nation in my hands. I'd been more than this, and I still was, even if no one saw it. The spark grew a quiet fire, and I felt something shift inside me, like a lock turning after years of rust. I went back inside, finished the dishes, and drove home. The next day, I was back at my desk filing reports, smiling at Linda's half-hearted thanks, but something was different. I carried the spark with me, tucked deep inside, and it made me stand a little straighter, move a little surer. I didn't know what was coming, but I felt it, the way you feel the air change before a storm. My family could call me a burden, a spinster, a nobody. But I was Margaret Elise Kane, and I was Sparrow. And that truth was starting to hum low and insistent, like a song I'd forgotten how to sing. The invitation came in a cream envelope, sealed with a gold-embossed crest, and I nearly tossed it in the trash without opening it. It was a week after that family dinner, the sting of my mother's words, instead of this still lingering like a bruise. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm telling you this because it's the moment everything began to shift, though I didn't know it then. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days, its presence like a whisper I couldn't ignore. When I finally slid it open, the card inside was heavy. The words formal, "You are cordially invited to the annual Military Honors Gala in recognition of service to our nation." My name was printed in elegant script, but there was no mistake it was meant for me. I set it down, my hands unsteady, and felt that spark from the wedding, from the rainy morning flare, into something brighter, something dangerous. I almost didn't go. The gala was in the next town, over at a grand hotel I'd never set foot in, and the thought of standing among uniforms and medals, among people who might know Sparrow, made my chest tight. I hadn't worn that name in over a decade, hadn't spoken of that life to anyone. My family would be there too, Karen, Tom, even my mother, because our town was small, and an event like this drew everyone with a connection to the military. Tom's son, my nephew, was a cadet, and Karen never missed a chance to preen in public. They'd expect me to show up, but not for me, never for me. To them, I was just Margaret, the one who'd tag along and fade into the background. I stared at the invitation, my thumb tracing the crest, and thought of the metal box in my closet, the commendation letter, the bullet casing. I thought of Sparrow, and for the first time in years, I didn't push her away. The night of the gala, I stood in front of my mirror, smoothing the lines of a black dress I'd bought on impulse. A simple, elegant thing, nothing flashy, but it fit like it was made for me. My hair was pinned up, a few strands falling loose, and I wore no jewelry except a small silver pin. A gift from Hawk years ago, shaped like a bird in flight. I looked at myself, really looked, and saw her Sparrow flickering in the set of my jaw, the steadiness of my gaze. I didn't know why I was going, not really. Maybe it was duty or curiosity, or that spark refusing to be ignored. But as I slipped on my coat and stepped into the cool October evening, I felt a quiet resolve, like the moment before, a mission when you know there's no turning back. The hotel was a vision of opulence, all chandeliers and marble, the kind of place that made you feel small if you let it. I handed my invitation to a young man in a crisp uniform, his eyes flicking over me with polite indifference. "This way, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward the ballroom. I followed, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor, my heart a steady drum in my chest. The room was already full, a sea of dress blues and evening gowns. the air thick with the clink of glasses and the low hum of important conversations. I scanned the crowd and saw Karen near the front, her laugh sharp and bright, her arm linked with a man in a colonel's uniform. Tom was there too, clapping his son on the shoulder, his pride loud enough to fill the room. My mother sat at a table nearby, her face composed, her eyes scanning the crowd, but never landing on me. I hesitated at the entrance, my breath catching. I could leave slip out before anyone noticed, go back to my quiet apartment and my quiet life. But then I saw my name on a seating chart, scrawled in hasty ink at a table in the back, near the kitchen doors. Table 32, the last one tucked behind a pillar where the light barely reached. I felt a familiar pang. They didn't even reserve me a seat. And for a moment I was back at the wedding, standing by the dessert table, invisible. But I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my dress, and walked to my table, my steps deliberate. I was here and I wouldn't run. The table was half empty, occupied by a few older women. I didn't know their husbands in faded jackets, their conversations muted. They nodded at me, polite but distant, and I sat my hands folded in my lap. My eyes on the stage at the front of the room. A banner hung above it, gold letters on navy, honoring our heroes. My throat tightened and I looked away, focusing on the flicker of candlelight on the tablecloth. I didn't belong here, not anymore. Sparrow was a ghost, and Margaret was nobody. Yet I stayed because something, maybe that spark, maybe something deeper, told me I had to. The evening began with speeches, a general, with a chest full of medals, talking about sacrifice and duty. His voice was steady, commanding, and I felt a pull, a memory of briefing rooms and urgent orders. I pushed it down, sipping water from a heavy glass, my fingers tracing the edge. Karen's laugh cut through the room again, and I glanced at her table where she was whispering to the colonel, her eyes bright with ambition. Tom was boasting to a group of cadets, his voice carrying over the applause. My mother clapped politely, her face a mask, and I wondered, not for the first time, why I kept trying with them, why I kept showing up when they made it so clear I wasn't wanted. A young woman in a red dress approached my table, her smile tight. "Margaret Wright," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I recognized her. Lila, one of Emily's friends, married to a lieutenant. "Karen said you'd be here, but I didn't expect you at this table." She laughed, a quick, cutting sound. "I mean, it's a military event, so why are you here exactly?" I felt the eyes of the other women at my table shift to me, curious, waiting. I could have told her about Sparrow, about the missions that kept men like her husband safe, about the nights I'd spent ensuring crises never reached their doorstep. But I didn't. I smiled, soft and steady, and said, "Just supporting the family." She smirked, satisfied, and walked away, her heels clicking like a metronome. I felt the spark flare again, hotter now, and I gripped my glass a little tighter. Lila's words weren't new. Karen had said worse, Tom had implied it. My mother had made it clear, but they landed differently tonight. Here in this room, filled with symbols of a life I'd left behind. I looked at the stage where the general was introducing a veteran, a man in his 60s who stood tall despite his cane. The crowd applauded, and I clapped too, my hands moving on instinct, but my mind was elsewhere. I remembered standing in rooms like this, not as a guest, but as a force, my presence noted, my voice heard. I remembered who I'd been, and it hurt because no one here did. The kitchen doors swung open behind me, a waiter rushing out with a tray, and the noise startled me. I set my glass down, my hands steady again, and glanced at my table mates. One of the women, her hair white and wispy, leaned toward me. "You look like you've seen your share of these events," she said, her voice kind but probing. I nodded, my smile polite. "A few," I said, and left it at that. She didn't press, but her eyes lingered like she saw something I wasn't saying. I turned back to the stage, my heart pounding, and tried to focus on the next speaker. A woman in a captain's uniform, her voice sharp with pride. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was out of place, that I was trespassing on a life that wasn't mine anymore. Karen's table was loud with laughter, Tom's with bravado, and I was here at table 32, hidden behind a pillar, my name an afterthought. I thought of the invitation, the crest, the way it had felt like a summons. Why had it come? Why now? I didn't have answers, but I felt the spark growing, a quiet fire that refused to be ignored. I straightened in my chair, my hands smoothing the napkin in my lap, and told myself to stay, to see this through, whatever it was. The gala continued, the speeches blending into one another, the crowd clapping on cue. I watched, I listened, I stayed silent. But inside, Sparrow was waking her wings, brushing against the edges of my heart, and I knew somehow that this night wasn't like the others. Something was coming, and I was ready, or as ready as I'd ever be. The gala's rhythm had settled into a predictable hum, speeches, applause, the clink of silverware against plates. I sat at table 32, my hands folded in my lap, the candlelight casting shadows across my untouched salad. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm telling you this because it's the moment everything changed, the moment the spark I'd carried for weeks caught fire and burned through the silence I'd built around myself. The air in the ballroom felt heavier now, charged like the pause before a storm breaks. I didn't know why not yet, but I felt it in my bones, the way I used to feel, a mission shifting before the orders came. The woman in the captain's uniform had just finished her speech, her voice still echoing as the crowd clapped politely. I joined in, my hands moving automatically, but my eyes were on the room, scanning the faces, the uniforms, the way. The light caught on medals and epaulets. Karen's laugh rang out from the front, sharp and performative, and I saw her lean into the colonel, her hand on his arm. Tom was holding court with a group of cadets, his voice booming while my mother sat stiffly, her gaze fixed on the stage. None of them looked my way, and I was glad for it. I wanted to stay hidden, to let table 32 and its shadows keep me safe. But that spark, that restless fire, wouldn't let me settle. It was growing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The master of ceremonies, a major, with a clipped voice, took the podium again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have an unexpected guest tonight. Someone who's asked to address you directly." A murmur rippled through the room, heads turning, glasses pausing mid-sip. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, the kind I used to get when a mission was about to go sideways. I straightened in my chair, my hands still, my breath slow. The major cleared his throat. "Please welcome the Honorable James R. Callahan, Director of National Intelligence." The room went still, a collective intake of breath. Callahan. I knew the name, though I'd never met him. He was a legend in the intelligence community, a man who'd shaped policy and strategy for decades. Whispers spread like wildfire. "He's here," whine I felt, my pulse quicken, though I didn't let it show. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and he stepped inside, flanked by two aides in dark suits. He was older than I'd expected. His hair silver, his face lined but sharp, his presence commanding in a way that didn't need a uniform. The crowd rose to its feet, applause thundering, and I stood too, because you didn't stay seated for a man like that, not in this world. He moved to the stage with purpose, his eyes scanning the room, not smiling, not waving, just looking. I lowered my gaze, focusing on the tablecloth, the flicker of the candle. I didn't belong here, not in the presence of someone like him. Sparrow was a memory, a ghost, and I was just Margaret, the woman at the back, the one nobody saw. The applause faded, and Callahan raised a hand, silencing the room. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, but carrying the kind that made you lean in. "I'm not here to give a speech. I'm here for someone." My heart stuttered, but I kept my eyes down, my hands clasped tightly. The room was silent now, every rustle of fabric, every clink of a glass amplified. I could feel the weight of his gaze moving across the crowd, searching, and I told myself it wasn't for me. It couldn't be. I'd left that life behind, buried it under years of silence and small-town routine. But the spark inside me was a flame now hot and insistent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something I couldn't stop. Callahan stepped away from the podium, descending the stage steps with a slow, deliberate stride. The aides followed, but he waved them back, his focus singular. "I've spent my career working with the best," he said, his voice cutting through the hush. "Men and women who gave everything, who carried burdens most will never understand. Tonight, I'm here to honor one of them." The crowd shifted heads, turning, whispers starting again. I glanced up just for a moment and saw Karen craning her neck, her eyes bright with curiosity. Tom leaned forward, his brow furrowed, and even my mother looked alert. Her hands clasped tightly. They thought it was someone important, someone worthy. Not me, never me. He kept walking, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor, moving past the front tables, past the colonels and generals, past Karen's smug smile, and Tom's puffed-up pride. The room watched transfixed, and I felt my breath catch my hands, trembling despite my effort to stay calm. I knew that walk, that focus. I'd seen it in briefing rooms, in moments when lives hung in the balance. He wasn't here for ceremony. He was here for a purpose. And then, impossibly, his eyes found mine. I froze, my heart a drum against my ribs. He was still halfway across the room, but his gaze locked onto me, steady, unyielding, like he'd known exactly where I'd be. I wanted to look away, to shrink back into the shadows of table 32, but I couldn't. There was something in his expression, recognition, respect, maybe even urgency, that pinned me in place. The woman next to me, the one with the white hair, noticed and leaned closer. "Do you know him?" she whispered. I shook my head, a small automatic motion, but my mind was racing. I didn't know him, not personally, but I knew men like him. I'd worked with them, answered to them, stood in rooms where their decisions shaped the world. And now he was walking toward me. The crowd parted as he approached, a sea of faces turning to follow. Karen's laughter stopped, her head whipping around. Tom's mouth opened, then closed. My mother's hands tightened in her lap, her eyes narrowing. I could feel their confusion, their disbelief, but I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on Callahan, on the way he moved with the certainty of someone who'd never doubted his path. He stopped a few feet from my table, the room so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now but still carrying, "we've been looking for you." The words hit me like a shockwave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, but my face stayed calm, because that's what Sparrow did. She stayed calm even when the world tilted. I felt the eyes of the room on me, hundreds of them, and the weight was crushing, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. "Sir," I said, my voice steady, though it took everything in me to keep it that way. "I think you have the wrong person." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips, not mocking, but knowing, like he'd expected my response. "No, ma'am," he said, "I don't." He took another step, closing the distance, and I saw the aides behind him exchange a glance, their postures tense. The crowd was silent, the air electric with anticipation. Karen's face was pale, her mouth half open. Tom was frozen, his hands gripping the back of his chair. My mother stared, her expression unreadable, but sharp, like she was seeing me for the first time. Callahan extended a hand, not to shake, but to gesture a quiet invitation to stand. "Please," he said, and there was no command in his tone, only respect, the kind I hadn't heard in years. I hesitated, my heart pounding, the spark now ablaze I couldn't contain. I didn't want this, not the attention, not the exposure, but something in his eyes, in the way he stood there waiting, told me I didn't have a choice. Not anymore. I pushed my chair back, the scrape, loud in the silence, and stood, my dress falling smoothly around me, the silver pin on my chest catching the light. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I felt Sparrow rise inside me, her wings unfurling, her strength steadying my trembling hands. I didn't know what Callahan wanted or why he was here, but I knew this moment was bigger than me, bigger than table 32, bigger than the years I'd spent hiding. I took a step forward, my eyes never leaving his, and felt the past rush in, not as a memory, but as a force ready to claim its place. I stood there, the ballroom's silence pressing against me. Like a physical weight, Director Callahan's hand still extended, his eyes locked on mine. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm telling you this because it's the moment my world cracked open, the moment the truth I'd buried for years rose up and demanded to be seen. My legs felt unsteady, but I didn't waver, didn't let the hundreds of eyes boring into me, Karen's, Tom's, my mother's, pull me under. The spark that had flickered at the wedding that had grown through the rain, and the gala's shadows was a fire now burning through my restraint, through the life I'd built to hide Sparrow. And yet, even as I stood, I wanted to shrink back, to tell Callahan he was mistaken, to slip out the kitchen doors and disappear. But his gaze held me steady and sure, and I knew there was no running from this. Margaret Elise Kane, he said, his voice clear, reverend, cutting through the hush like a blade. Codename Sparrow. The words landed like a thunderclap, and I felt my breath catch my hands, trembling at my sides. The room gasped a collective sound that rippled from the front tables to the back, where I stood by table 32. I heard a glass clink, a chair creak, but I didn't look away from Callahan. He stepped closer, his aides trailing behind their faces, taut with something like awe. "You didn't think we'd forgotten, did you?" he said, softer now, almost private, but the microphone pinned to his lapel carried every word. I opened my mouth to protest, to say I was just Margaret, that Sparrow was gone, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, my heart pounding so loud I thought the room could hear it. Karen's face flashed in my peripheral vision, her mouth open, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tom was half standing, his hands gripping the table, his jaw slack. My mother's gaze burned into me, sharp and unreadable, but I didn't turn to them. I couldn't. Callahan's presence, his voice, the weight of that name Sparrow had tethered me to the moment, to the truth I'd locked away. "I'm retired." I managed my voice low but steady, the kind I'd used in briefing rooms when the stakes were life and death. That was a long time ago. I wanted to downplay it, to push Sparrow back into the shadows, but Callahan shook his head, that faint smile returning the one that said he knew better. "No, ma'am," he said, his tone firm but warm. "Some service doesn't end. Some sacrifices don't fade." He turned to the crowd, his hand gesturing toward me, and I felt the spotlight shift its glare, hot on my skin. This woman, he said, stood at the heart of operations that saved countless lives. She carried burdens most of us will never comprehend, and she did it without seeking recognition. Tonight we're here to change that. The room was frozen, every face turned toward me, every breath held. I saw Lila, the young woman in the red dress, her smirk gone, her eyes wide with shock. The general who'd spoken earlier was standing now, his hand raised in a salute, and others followed, colonels, captains, cadets, their movements slow, deliberate, a wave of respect that made my chest ache. I wanted to look away, to hide, but I didn't. I stood taller, my hands steadying, and felt Sparrow rise inside me, not as a ghost, but as a force, her strength filling the cracks I'd let form over the years. Callahan turned back to me, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but the microphone carried it. "Sparrow, you were one of our finest. Your work on Operation Nightshade changed the course of history." The name hit me like a bullet, and I closed my eyes for a moment, the memory rushing in, unbidden, unstoppable. I was 32, crouched in a safe house, in a city I can't name, the air thick with smoke and fear. The mission was Nightshade, a high-stakes operation to intercept a plot that could have sparked a global conflict. I'd been awake for 3 days, my eyes burning, my hands shaking as I decrypted the final message, the one that pinpointed the target. The team was ready, but the intel was incomplete, and I had to make a call, send them in, or wait. Waiting meant risk, but so did moving too soon. I sat there alone in that room, the clock ticking, and chose. I sent them in, my voice steady over the radio, my heart screaming with doubt. The mission succeeded, the threat was neutralized, but 2 agents didn't come back. Their faces haunted me for years, their names etched into my soul. I'd saved thousands, maybe millions, but the cost was a weight I'd carried ever since. I opened my eyes, the ballroom swimming back into focus, and realized Callahan was still speaking. Operation Nightshade was a turning point, he said, and Sparrow was its architect. She made the call that stopped a catastrophe at a cost she's never spoken of. That's who stands before you tonight. He paused, his eyes meeting mine again, and I saw something there, gratitude maybe, or understanding. We owe you, Sparrow. This nation owes you. The crowd erupted applause, thundering through the room, but I barely heard it. My eyes were on Callahan, on the way he stood, not as a superior, but as an equal honoring me, in a way I'd never expected. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back, because Sparrow didn't cry, not in front of a room like this. I nodded a small gesture, and he returned it, his hand rising in a slow, deliberate salute. The room followed a sea of hands raised, and I felt the weight of their respect. Their reverence settle over me like a mantle. I turned just slightly and saw my family. Karen was pale, her hands clutching her napkin, her eyes darting between me and the crowd. Tom was sitting now, his face red, his mouth moving, like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. My mother stared, her expression a mix of shock and something else, regret maybe, or shame. I didn't linger on them. I couldn't. The moment was too big, too heavy, and I was still trying to hold it together to keep Sparrow and Margaret from splitting apart. Callahan stepped closer, his voice low now meant just for me. You didn't have to stay silent all these years, he said, but I understand why you did. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that held medals, and my heart stopped. This is long overdue, he said, and opened it, revealing a silver star, its edges catching the light. For your service, Sparrow, for your sacrifice. I shook my head, instinctive, because I didn't need it. I did my job, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but he pressed the box into my hands, his grip firm, and I felt the weight of it. Not just the metal, but the years, the secrets, the losses. I took it, my fingers closing around it, and the room applauded again, louder now, a sound that shook the chandeliers. I looked out at the crowd, at the faces I didn't know, the ones I did, and felt something break inside me, not pain but release. I'd carried Sparrow alone for so long, hidden her behind smiles and silence, but now she was here, seen, known. I didn't need their approval, not Karen's, not Tom's, not my mother's, but I felt it, the justice of this moment, the way it righted something I hadn't realized was wrong. The applause faded, and Callahan stepped back, gesturing for me to sit, but I didn't. I stood there, the box in my hands, the pin on my chest glinting, and let the room see me, Margaret Elise Kane Sparrow, both of them whole. I didn't speak, didn't need to. My silence, my presence said enough. The applause faded, leaving a hush in the ballroom that felt alive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood by table 32, the velvet box heavy in my hands, the silver star inside it, catching the chandelier's light. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm telling you this, because it's the moment the world I'd known, the one built on silence and dismissal, shifted not with a shout, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. Director Callahan had stepped back, his salute lingering in the air, and the room was different now. The faces turned toward me, not with pity or indifference, but with something I hadn't felt in years, reverence. I wanted to sit, to shrink back, into the shadows, but Sparrow held me upright, her strength steady in my spine, and I let the moment hold me too. The crowd began to move, a slow ripple of motion, as people stood their chairs, scraping softly against the marble floor. A colonel near the front approached, his medals gleaming, his hand extended. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with respect. "It's an honor." I shook his hand, my grip firm, despite the tremor in my fingers, and nodded, because words felt too small for the weight of his gesture. Others followed, captains, lieutenants, civilians, in evening gowns, their eyes wide with awe, their voices low, as they murmured thanks, as if I'd done something for them personally. I hadn't, not directly, but I understood. They were thanking Sparrow, the woman who'd carried secrets, so they could sleep soundly, and I let them, because for the first time I didn't feel the need to hide her. I glanced at my table where the white-haired woman who'd spoken earlier was watching me, her eyes bright with tears. "I knew there was something about you," she whispered, her hand reaching for mine. I squeezed it gently, a small connection in the sea of faces, and felt a warmth spread through me, not pride, but something softer like relief. The room was alive with whispers, now names and stories. Sparrow Nightshade's sacrifice, and I felt exposed raw, but not afraid. I'd spent years fearing this the moment my past would break free, but now that it was here, it felt right, like a wound finally allowed to breathe. I saw Karen before she reached me, her mauve gown catching the light. As she wove through the crowd, her face pale, her steps hesitant, she stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting together, her eyes darting from me to the box in my hands. "Margaret," she said, her voice cracking, and I saw it then, the regret, the shame, the realization that she'd been wrong about me, so wrong for so long. I didn't know." Her words were a plea, an apology, wrapped in disbelief, and I felt a pang, not of anger, but of pity. She'd spent years cutting me down, calling me a burden, a nobody, and now the truth was a mirror she couldn't look away from. I could have said something sharp, could have let the years of hurt spill out, but I didn't. I looked at her, my sister, her face so like our mother's, and said, "You weren't supposed to know." My voice was soft, steady, the kind I'd used on missions when the truth had to be enough. Her eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth, but no words came. She nodded a jerky motion and stepped back, her hands falling to her sides. I didn't watch her go. I didn't need to. Her regret was hers to carry, now not mine. Tom was next, his face flushed, his tie loosened as if he'd been pulling at it. He stopped short, his hands hovering, like he wasn't sure what to do with them. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was hoarse, like he'd been shouting, though he hadn't. "Why didn't you tell us all this time you—" He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the velvet box, then back to my face, searching for the sister he thought he knew. I saw the guilt there, the memory of his muttered words at the wedding, his casual dismissal in the hardware store. He wanted absolution, but I wasn't sure I had it to give. I couldn't, I said, my tone, even not cold, but final. It wasn't mine to tell. He flinched just slightly, and I saw the weight of his own words settle on him, the years he'd called me nothing, the times he'd looked through me. He nodded, his jaw tight, and muttered, "I'm sorry," before turning away, his shoulders hunched. I watched him go, his figure swallowed by the crowd, and felt a quiet ache, not for him, but for the family we might have been, if they'd ever bothered to see me. My mother was last. She didn't approach, didn't weave through the crowd, like Karen and Tom. She sat at her table, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on me across the room. I met her gaze, and for a moment it was just us. The noise fading, the crowd blurring. I saw the regret in her face, the way her lips trembled, the way she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. She'd called my life a failure, a disappointment, but now she knew, Sparrow Nightshade, the star in my hands, and it was too much for her to hold. I didn't go to her. I didn't need to. Her silence, her stillness, was apology enough, and I let it be. The master of ceremonies took the podium again, his voice breaking the spell. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's continue the evening with a toast to all our honorees, including Ms. Margaret Kane." The crowd raised their glasses, the clink of crystal filling the air, and I stood there, the box still in my hands, the weight of their respect grounding me. Callahan returned to my side, his presence steady, and leaned in. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low, and I felt my heart skip, unsure if I could take more. He gestured to an aide who stepped forward, holding a folded flag, the kind given at ceremonies for those who've served beyond measure. It was small, ceremonial, its stars bright against the blue, and Callahan took it. his hands careful, almost tender. "This is for you," he said, and placed it in my arms, the fabric heavy, sacred, for nightshade and everything else. I felt tears prick my eyes again, but I held them back, my fingers tightening around the flag. Its weight a reminder of the agents I'd lost, the choices I'd made, the life I'd lived. The room was silent again, and Callahan raised his hand in another salute, slower this time, more personal. I returned it, my arm steady, my heart full, and the crowd followed a sea of hands, honoring not just Sparrow, but me, Margaret, whole and seen. I sat then, my legs trembling, the flag and the box in my lap, the room resuming its rhythm around me. People approached, offering quiet words, handshakes, nods, but I felt a calm settle over me, a peace I hadn't known I needed. Lila, the woman in the red dress, lingered nearby. Her face flushed, her eyes avoiding mine. She didn't speak, and I didn't expect her to. The Colonel Karen had been charming, watched me now, his expression thoughtful, and I saw Karen notice her face tightening. Tom rejoined his table, his laughter gone, his son looking at him with new questions. My mother stayed seated, her hands still clasped, her eyes never leaving me. The gala continued, more speeches, a band starting up, the clatter of plates as dinner was served, but it was different now. I was different. I sat at table 32, the flag and the star, my silent companions, and felt Sparrow and Margaret merge not as two lives, but as one whole at last. I didn't need their apologies, their explanations. I'd carried my truth alone, and now it was free, not to wound, but to heal. The gala's lights had dimmed the music, softening into a gentle waltz as the night wound down. I sat at table 32, the folded flag and velvet box resting in my lap, their weight a quiet anchor. My name is Margaret Elise Kane, and I'm telling you this because it's the end of the story, but not the end of me. The room had changed, the air no longer heavy with dismissal, but warm with respect. Yet I felt a pull to leave, to step back into the life I'd chosen, not as a retreat, but as a return. The truth had been spoken, Sparrow had been seen, and now I could go home, not as the woman who'd hidden, but as the woman who'd stood whole and unbroken. I rose, slipping the box into my purse, cradling the flag against my chest. The crowd had thinned, some guests dancing, others lingering at tables, their voices a low hum. I moved toward the exit, my steps steady, my black dress catching the light as I passed. A few people nodded their eyes, meeting mine with a quiet acknowledgement, and I returned it, a small tilt of my head, because words weren't needed anymore. Karen was at her table, her face turned away, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. Tom stood by the bar, his son at his side, his laughter replaced by a thoughtful silence. My mother was still seated, her gaze following me, but I didn't stop. I'd given them my truth, and what they did with it was theirs to decide. The young man at the door, the one who'd taken my invitation, held it open, now his posture straighter, his eyes wide with something like awe. "Good night, ma'am," he said, and I heard the respect in his voice, the kind I'd once known as Sparrow. I nodded, stepping into the cool October air, the stars bright above the hotel's grand facade. My car was parked at the edge of the lot, unassuming like me, and I walked to it, the flag warm against my arms, the silver pin on my chest glinting faintly. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The night had done what it was meant to do. Driving home, the road stretched dark and quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft rustle of my dress. I thought of the gala of Callahan's salute, of the flag in my lap, and felt a peace settle over me, deep and steady, like a river finding its course. I'd spent years believing my silence was a cage, but now I saw it for what it was. Strength, not weakness, a choice to carry my truth alone until the moment it was needed. Sparrow hadn't been buried. She'd been waiting, and tonight she'd flown not to soar but to rest her wings folded at last. I pulled into my apartment's parking lot, the building as plain as ever, its windows dark, except for a few glowing softly. I climbed the stairs, my heels clicking, and unlocked my door. the familiar scent of coffee and old books greeting me. Inside, I set the flag and the box on my kitchen table, their presence transforming the space, making it feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. I slipped off my shoes, my feet aching, and stood there barefoot, letting the silence wrap around me. It wasn't the silence of absence anymore, but of fullness, of a life lived and claimed. I moved to my closet, pulling out the metal box I'd opened that rainy morning, its lock cold under my fingers. I opened it, the hinges creaking, and placed the velvet box inside next to the commendation letter, the bullet casing the faded badge. The silver star gleamed a quiet companion to the relics of Sparrow's life, and I felt a pang not of loss, but of completion. I didn't need to open it again, didn't need to prove anything to myself or anyone else. I closed the box, locked it, and slid it back onto the shelf, but this time it wasn't to hide. It was to rest. The flag was different. I carried it to my living room, setting it on the small table by my couch, in where the morning light would touch it. It wasn't a trophy or a boast, but a reminder of Nightshade, of the agents I'd lost, of the choices that had shaped me. I ran my fingers over the stars, their stitches rough under my touch, and thought of Hawk, his voice whispering, "Stay with me, Sparrow." I thought of the rooftop, the signal, flashing the weight of a nation in my hands. I thought of the years I'd spent as Margaret quiet and unseen, and realized they weren't wasted. They were part of me as much as Sparrow, and together they'd brought me here. The next morning I woke early, the sky pale with dawn. I made coffee the routine familiar but lighter now, and sat by the window watching the town stir. Mrs. Delaney waved from the corner store, her smile warmer than usual, and I wondered if word had spread, if the gala had changed how they saw me. It didn't matter, not really. I didn't need their eyes to know who I was. I sipped my coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and felt the peace again, steady and sure like a heartbeat. Karen called later that day, her voice hesitant, almost fragile. "Margaret," she said, "can we talk about everything I heard?" The guilt, the need to make amends, but I wasn't ready, not yet. "Maybe soon," I said, my tone gentle but firm, and hung up. Tom sent a text, a simple, "I'm sorry," and I didn't reply. My mother left a voicemail, her voice trembling, asking me to come over, but I let it sit unanswered. They'd see me again in time, but on my terms, not theirs. I'd given them enough. At work, Linda noticed the change, though she didn't know why. "You seem different," she said, her eyes lingering on me as I filed reports. I smiled, not the polite one I'd worn for years, but a real one, small but true. "Just had a good weekend," I said, and left it at that. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, the office still hummed with chatter, but I moved through it with a new ease, my shoulders straighter, my steps surer. I wasn't Sparrow in those moments, not Margaret either, but both woven together, and that was enough. Days passed, then weeks, and the gala faded into memory, but its truth stayed with me. I went to church, sang hymns, nodded at Emily's friends, but I didn't feel their pity anymore. I helped Mrs. Delaney with her bags, stayed late for Linda, wrote thank you notes to those who'd reached out after the gala. I lived my life quiet as ever, but it was mine now, not a shadow of what others expected. The flag sat on my table, the pins stayed in my jewelry box, and sometimes at night I'd touch them not to remember, but to honor, to carry them forward. One evening I stood in my living room, the flag in my hands, its weight familiar now. I folded it slowly, each crease precise, the way I'd been taught years ago, and placed it in a wooden case I'd bought, its glass lid clear and strong. I set it on my bookshelf next to my novels where it belonged. Not hidden, not flaunted, but present a quiet testament to who I'd been, who I was. I stepped back, my hands steady, and felt a final release, not of Sparrow or Margaret, but of the need to explain either. They were me, and I was enough. I'm sharing this with you because I know what it's like to carry a truth no one sees, to think your worth depends on their eyes. But you don't need to explain your past to anyone. It lives in your spine, in the way you walk, in the choices you make when no one's watching. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered if your story matters, hear this, it does. You do. Hold your truth close. Let it guide you, and when the moment comes, stand in it. Not for their applause, but for your own peace. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is yours too, and together we can keep telling it one quiet, powerful step at a time. I turned off the light, the room falling dark, and walked to my door, stepping out into the night. The stars were out bright and steady, and I lifted my head, my breath visible in the cool air. I was Margaret Elise Kane. I was Sparrow, and I was home.